hello, everyone who's joining us here today. As I see people entering the waiting room as we kick off this webinar, I want to welcome all of you to the launch of two very, very significant reports. More people will be joining as we go along, but it is absolutely key that we honor those that are with us and we start as we had promised on time. Today, as mentioned, is significant because we're looking at two important reports that speak of where we are as far as the HIV response is concerned and the state of the world as well. The reports are titled Domestic Revenue, Debt Relief and Development Aid, Transformative Pathways to Ending AIDS by 2030. One of the reports is focused on East and Southern Africa and the other on West and Central Africa. So we want to thank you all, say thank you to all of you for joining us from various parts of the world and taking an interest in this issue. We extend a warm welcome to our colleagues from missions and governments who are joining us here today, civil society, communities, members of the media here as well, UNAIDS and its co-sponsors, our colleagues from PEPFAR and the Global Fund. To everyone here today, a warm welcome. Translation is also available for this webinar for all our French-speaking attendees, so please make use of this facility. For ease of access, though these reports have been shared under embargo, which actually lifted at the start of this webinar, we are posting links to both of them, and those links are available in the chat function. And today we have key advocates on this issue, all of them on one panel, as Matthew had commented earlier on. So we're very privileged to be hearing from these voices in the world share their thoughts, their insights from their research, and the body of their work across their lifetime. Now, these reports come at a time where the HIV response is at a critical juncture, where the world is now beyond the midpoint towards achieving the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Financing is a growing challenge. Increasing public debt is choking sub-Saharan countries, leaving them with very little fiscal room to finance health and other critical HIV services. So these reports set out the context and the confluence of forces that have led us to where we are today. They lay out HIV financing as it currently stands in these regions, and the research looks at 41 countries, which is quite expansive. They explore the spending that would be required to end AIDS as a public health threat, and they look at possible scenarios, and they explore how the financing gap can be filled. And then lastly, they provide actionable strategies to close the financing gaps for the HIV response. So today, our agenda includes opening remarks. There will be a word from one of our joint authors of the reports. We also look at the impact of debt, distress, and fiscal constraint on human rights, on education, and poverty eradication. And today we'll also hear discussions on these themes and much more. And we also invite you to ask questions throughout the session by typing them in the chat function. They will be posed to our panelists during the question and answer segment at the bottom half hour of this presentation. So let's kick things off. And to share her opening remarks and her introductions, it is my pleasure today to introduce UNAIDS Executive Director, Winnie Bwanyima.
Thank you. Thank you, Azania. I'm delighted to be here with all of you to launch these two very important reports. Let me share a few reflections before we get that detailed overview of the reports from Matthew. I want to talk about the challenges before us and the cost of inaction. It was in the 80s, in the 1980s, when Africa lost that decade under the stranglehold of debt. And it was our great leader, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, then president of Tanzania, who asked the question that should we really let our people starve so that we can pay our debts? Today, in the spirit of Nyerereism, I'm also asking the question, should we let our people die from preventable diseases like HIV and AIDS, while we negotiate debt relief that is coming slowly and too little of it? I'm asking that question because today is a moment when there is urgency. Every moment of delaying to restructure the debt, the unsustainable debt that many countries in Africa and other countries, including middle-income countries of Asia, for example, every moment we delay is incurring a heavy price. In Western Central Africa, countries spend 5.5 times more on debt than on health. And in Eastern and Southern Africa, it is 2.7 times more on debt than on health. It's unacceptable. We will never be able to achieve the SDG target of ending AIDS by 2030 under such financial constraints. The G20 Common Framework, I think it's time to say it very clearly that it has failed. Just being able to deliver debt relief to 3 countries in 3 years after endless cycles of negotiations that are complicated, it's just not going to work. It has failed. And this makes it now so important to call out and call for debt restructuring that includes all debtors, not just governments, but including private creditors rather. As the UN Secretary General has said, the global financial architecture is broken. It does not serve the purpose of ensuring that countries achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We have something there in the global framework, the common framework, that is just inadequate. So as our work to end AIDS demonstrates, improving people's health requires more than prevention and treatment. Education, particularly access to secondary education for adolescent girls and young women, is critical in Africa. When girls remain at school longer, their chances of HIV transmission reduce drastically. But also counting on economic opportunities and building social protection systems is much needed. We learned this the hard way, as I just said, in the 1980s during Latin America's debt crisis, which dragged on for a decade before any resolution was found. The same, Africa also lost a decade. It took 20 years after that speech of Julius Nyerere for the IMF and the World Bank to come up with the HIPIC initiative, the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative. We cannot afford to wait another 20 years. No. The cost of delay in this era of COVID and HIV will be exponentially higher, with entire regions trapped in cycles of low growth and suffering. So what's needed? What's needed? We need a new consensus around an initiative similar to HIPIC that compels all actors, not just governments, to action and protects the rights of people in the developing countries, particularly in the low-income countries of Africa. Debt restructuring must happen for us to have a more self-reliant HIV response, and in order to build the strong public health and education systems that can anchor prevention of HIV. African countries need to raise more domestic revenues too. That's the other side of the coin. With an average tax collection to GDP of 15.6%, that's in 2021, it's hard, very hard to increase the social investments that are needed to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and end AIDS. Here, we have to talk about more progressive tax policies on the continent of Africa in particular. The reliance on regressive tax policies like VAT is costing the continent. The lack of revenues has to do with that as well. I'm excited to see some movement at the G20 on taxing the super rich. This is happening under the leadership of Brazil. It's not only about global policies that encourage taxing the super rich, but it's also about global collaboration on that question. This is something very important too, moving towards more progressive taxation and letting the rich pay their fair share. There's also the issue of closing tax loopholes. That too, combating tax avoidance is critical today more than ever before. We need that UN tax conference where member states can agree together how to collaborate and close the loopholes that companies use to avoid paying their fair share. That UN tax convention is long overdue. So G20 needs to take renewed steps towards an overarching initiative that frees countries from deepening debt and allows them to increase growth and make the social investments needed. Summit of the Future is an important moment that could be a turning point. The upcoming Finance for Development Conference 2025 that will take place in Spain is an opportunity not to be missed. And we at UNAIDS will be there with others to push for those reforms that can free the fiscal space for the high burden countries to be able to fight and end AIDS. If we don't reform tax systems, if we don't demand debt relief and show just how much debt is costing us on our journey to end AIDS, then we will not be able to reach our target. The fight against AIDS is linked with tax reform, with debt relief, and with international solidarity. The Summit of the Future that's starting this weekend will discuss these global reforms, and we are happy to contribute to that dialogue with the launch of these two reports. We must act now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Winnie, for those remarks and setting the tone, setting the scene for the conversations that we will be having today. And of course, as you said, this comes at a time when the world is meeting so that there's a recommitment to multilateralism. But as you reflect on Winnie's opening remarks, please share your thoughts in the chat because we have a Q&A section coming up at the end. Now, these reports are the work of UNAIDS together with Development Finance International. And the authors are Matthew Martin and Gail Hurley. The project lead is Charles Birungi in Jaime's team here at UNAIDS. Gail is unable to join us, but we really thank her for her contribution. Here to present the findings of the report is Matthew Martin. Now, Matthew is the Director of Development Finance International, formerly with the World Bank, as well as Overseas Development Institute, as well as Oxford University. He's been advising developing countries, international organizations, and donors on development financing and debt issues since 1991. And he handles design and liaison with developing country policymakers, with donors and regional and international partner organizations. He's here because he has built the specialization over time, and he specializes in debt relief, analyzing the quality and sustainability of new aid and private flows and fiscal financial sector and macroeconomic issues. So here to present the main findings, which Winnie touched on, which really shocked when you think of the fact that 5.5 times over 50% of government revenue is devoted to debt servicing, but there's more in these reports. Matthew, over to you. You are on mute, Matthew. If we could start that over because we missed your opening comments.
No, a basic mistake. One
there
always
we have
makes
you.
Yes, so just before I launch my slides, let me say what a privilege it is to be speaking to a group of people who are at the front line of fighting HIV and AIDS and of trying to end AIDS as a public health threat in Africa by 2030. I'm passionate about these issues for two reasons. One is that I am of South African origin and have grown up and worked in Africa in the period when AIDS was raging without much financing of any kind coming in. And secondly, because Winnie referred to Julius Nyerere in her remarks, probably the proudest moment of my life was to be asked to give a speech in memoriam of him and of the governor of the Central Bank of Tanzania about 20 years ago, when we had just managed to get Tanzania enough debt relief that it could do universal free healthcare and universal free primary education, which were his promises to his people, which had been impossible to do because of their debt burden. And so I'm passionate but furious that we are now back in the same mess again. And it's not the fault of the countries, it's the fault of the international system. Let me also, just as I begin, thank profusely the colleagues who have really done most of the work on this. And those are Gail Hurley, who was already referred to in the introductory remarks, and who can't be with us today because she's currently busy in another meeting trying to get the debt of small island developing states cancelled. And my colleagues who I think are on the call with us, David Waddock and Maria Holloway, who were responsible for compiling all the amazing data on debt and tax and spending across the world that has gone into the reports. So let me now launch what I want to say. So first of all, as Winnie said, the reason why UNAIDS commissioned these reports is that everyone is aware that there are financing gaps which are unfilled, and that if we don't fill them, progress in fighting HIV and AIDS will stall. People will lose their treatment and will die. Never mind all the other social sector SDGs, which are essential to reach so that we get progress on HIV. Unless we have a step change in efforts to finance progress, and I want to particularly underline, finance it sustainably. So these two reports were commissioned. We built a whole new databases across the world, which are now being demanded and used by lots of other UN agencies, the IMF, and 1 million CSOs across the world as well. And we more and more demand growing for that. So thank you so much to UNAIDS for having, if you like, taken a leap, which is now proving very beneficial for lots of other people. And I should just say, in case you're wondering whether your country is covered, we couldn't get data for the small island developing states in Eastern Central Africa or for Gabon and Equatorial Guinea. So you won't see them in the reports, but you will see a lot of detail about country stuff and a lot more than I'm able to say. So please do read the reports. So I'm going to do this in two sections. One is the recent and current financing situation, and the other is the possible solutions that we have in the report. So as Winnie said at the beginning, there are financing gaps in both of these regions, but they have different proportions. So the financing gap in Eastern and Southern Africa, compared to needs in 2022, was only about $700 million, which is only about 8% of what was needed. But it's much higher in West Africa proportionally, only $950 million, but that's 32% of the country's needs that are not being fulfilled at the moment. There's also similarity in their sources of financing. Both regions have been highly dependent on donor financing. Of course, it varies across individual countries, though, of course, the absolute US dollar amount is much higher in Eastern and Southern Africa due to its initial very high HIV prevalence. A lot of donors have been spending most of their money there. But donor flows have recently been stagnating or falling in both regions, and this really raises major questions about the sustainability of the HIV response and potentially making impossible the strategy to end AIDS by 2030. There are also other similarities. Obviously, if you want to have sustainable financing, it's vital that over time HIV programs are funded out of national revenues to make spending sustainable and not dependent on donor flows. And countries, let's not understate this, countries have been making major efforts to try to increase their revenue mobilization, especially from taxes. But at the same time, partly due to shocks like COVID, tax revenue has fallen as a percentage of GDP in both regions. Why is this? Well, it's easy to focus, and we must all focus on what happens at national level. And we must be encouraging governments not to do what Kenya just did and try to tax poor people more, but actually to tax the wealthiest people and the biggest companies, because they're paying lower tax rates than the middle class in their countries, due to all the exemptions, the tax holidays, and the tax dodging that they either get or do. But it's also about the global system. The current international system is basically set up to allow wealthy people and large multinationals to ship their wealth to overseas tax havens and pay no tax on them. And that is in the process of changing, but much more needs to be done. Similarly, we're in a situation where there's very high debt service in both regions. It's risen very rapidly over the last decade, and it's now 9% of GDP, 53% of spending in the latest numbers we've just been analyzing. And that's higher than it was back in the days of the Latin American and HIPC debt crises. And even more vital, as Winnie said, is crowding out the spending on the SDGs, is 5 times health spending across Africa as a whole, 3 times education spending, and 27 times social protection spending, which is so vital to solving hunger and poverty issues. And this is resulting in cuts. The debt service is resulting in cuts or stagnation of spending, including on responses to HIV/AIDS. And it's not just a few countries, at least 35 are badly affected. And those are not just the lower income or smaller or conflict affected countries, but even wealthier countries like Namibia, Nigeria, South Africa are struggling because so much of their debt, of their budget is being absorbed by debt. So we've got to reduce debt service to sustain anti-HIV and other social spending. But the recent debt relief agreements, I'll be even blunter than Winnie, are totally inadequate. They leave countries still spending, after 3-5 years of negotiations, half their budgets on debt service for the foreseeable future. So what can we do? Well, first of all, I think there's some things which we don't deal with in a lot of detail in the report, but which everybody. So first of all, we did relook at financing needs as are being forecast by UNAIDS. When we adjusted them for inflation, which has been especially high recently, we found that they will go up from about 15 billion in nominal terms now to about 24 billion by 2030. And if we look at a business as usual, we test various scenarios in the report. If we look at a business as usual financing scenario, i.e. carrying on what we're doing now, there will be massive financing gaps. Millions of people will lose their treatment or never even have their disease diagnosed. And of course, Africa is vulnerable to climate, economic and pandemic shocks, which might make that even worse. Of course, you on the anti-HIV front line know that it's really vital that within its budget, each government commits to spend the maximum on HIV/AIDS, but also that governments commit to spend efficiently so we get the maximum results per US dollar. And I think we also need to not take the pressure off donors. They will all say, as they all are saying about every subject at the moment, there's no money for anything, because they're also obsessed with their own budgetary problems after COVID. But we need to, there are plenty of funding sources out there, global taxes, special drawing rights, all sorts of things I'm happy to come back to in the conversation afterwards. But fundamentally, the change and sustainability can only come from revenue mobilization and relief. So 2 quick slides on what can be done about each of those. So there is a huge amount African governments can do to increase the revenue they're raising from the wealthy. Some countries need to increase their corporate income tax rates on large companies or their personal income tax rates on the wealthiest individuals, or introduce or reinforce property and wealth taxes. And pretty much all countries need to step up the fight against tax dodging and end what I would call pro-rich exemptions from paying taxes. But a lot of countries are already trying to do this over the next few years. They're planning to increase their revenue by between 1% and 2% of GDP. So the scope for getting a lot more money out of this is relatively limited. I would say maybe of the same amount again, but that's not enough to close the HIV and AIDS financing gaps, let alone to find the funding for the other vital social complementary spending. So we have to look at debt relief. And here we have 2 proposals, which I've tried to simplify as much as I can, because I'm a debt relief wonk. So if anything is incomprehensible in this slide, let me know. One for what we would call the market-dependent middle-income countries, the countries which have to go to the market all the time to fund their budgets, like South Africa and Namibia. And here there's a phrase called credit enhancement. I won't bore you with the details, but basically it means taking measures, as the Secretary General has suggested, to halve their interest rates, their borrowing costs on their debt, so that they can reduce their debt service very sharply. For the other non-market low-income developing countries, which is most African countries, their service needs to be either sharply reduced or postponed over a very long period. And we're saying that they should reduce the debt service to a maximum of 15% of budget revenue compared to the current 50% through a 10-year debt service holiday. And we've estimated from our database that the annual amounts these measures would free up for sub-Saharan Africa to spend on the SDGs, about 4% of GDP or $97 billion a year, which is more than enough to fill what we estimate as being both the social and the climate spending gaps. So finally, is this a realistic agenda? Well, 2 years ago, I would have said no, because the world was basically saying there's no debt crisis and we can't tax rich people or companies. But I think the last couple of years, things have changed in a big way. And I think we now have a pretty unique opportunity with Brazil and South Africa being in charge of the G20, and maybe even if we get the right election result in America, the US G20 presidency, which comes after that. The world is already now accepting. I was on a call of the G20 last week where it was pretty much unanimous among the official community that there is a major debt service crisis, and it is a long-term crisis, and it needs serious action. Of course, it's not clear how fast they will move to deal with it, but at least having that concept accepted is a huge step forward. And they're also accepting the principle of the need for much stronger measures to tax both wealthy individuals, as when you referred to the G20 Brazil, and companies. And even if the world moves rather slowly on that in future, Africa itself, I think the door is open for it to do more on taxing these people. And I think finally, Africa is waking up to its potential to change the global debate. It admitted to a new seat at the table in what we should all now be calling the G21. And it's also pushing very hard for various decisions to be made in UN forums where Africa has more votes, decisions on tax and on debt and so on. And I think if African governments, with support from all of you, are prepared to fight both the global and the national fights, so we need to really keep pressure on them to do that, we can end AIDS as a public health threat in Africa by 2030. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Matthew. So much for us to dig into in our Q&A section. And you've really laid out what is contained in these reports. And I will echo your words that we urge everyone to read these reports because they have incredible insights and have just great detail on the various countries and their indebtedness. Let's move on to our next speaker, Professor Atiya Juarez. She is the UN independent expert on foreign debt, other international financing obligations, as well as human rights. Now, Atiya Juarez is Kenya's second full female law professor and the first professor from a religious, ethnic, and racial minority in the country. She's also the only known professor on fiscal law on the African continent. So we're really lucky to have her here with us to share her insights. And her original scholar contribution to this field has been the development and strengthening of the linkages between finance and development through taxation, debt, and illicit financial flows, and the raising of living standards. Professor Juarez this afternoon presents her remarks on how debt distress and fiscal constraints impact human rights. Prof?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the very kind introduction. I'm going to share my screen because I also have a PowerPoint. Let me know if you can see it.
Yes, we can.
Super. So thank you very much. And I'm going to speak as briefly as possible, but very much feeding on from the conversations that have already begun from both Winnie and Matthew. Oh dear. Okay, so there we go. So I have been developing what I call a life cycle approach to debt and fiscal constraints, and you can add tax into this conversation. And when I look at it, some of the things that keep triggering me is how long it takes to get a debt, 4 to 5 years. We've already heard that renegotiation takes really long. And then how long does it take to pay off a debt after you negotiate for it? Maybe another 5, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And how long is a human being's life cycle? And all of us know how long we live or don't live for, or hope to live for. So there's also the political life cycle. How long do we have a political regime in place? 5 years, 10 years, a lifetime, 40 years? All of these things have a direct impact on both debt and on the fiscal constraints facing a particular country, continent, and even a region. And then there is tax. How long does a tax stay in place? How long does it take to put a tax into place? How long does it take to remove that tax? All of these take years, never months, never quick, never speedy, except in certain scenarios. And that is when there is political will behind it. Currently, we are also sitting in what is seen as an illicit financial flow scenario. These have been in place for over 40 years, some of them longer. So these are all cycles, and they're all working with each other and together. And what I have done is I've actually developed what I call the life cycle approach. And so I want you to imagine 3 months before you were born, your parents thinking about having you. And if you were in a country where finances were catered for, then for the first 3 months, your mother would be getting prenatal supplements. 9 months on, you are born. If you're lucky, you are born and your mother stays alive, because we also know that there is statistics around children surviving birth, but parents not surviving birth. So now you continue with this life cycle. Now, this is the child. Well, how's the financial market cycle working in this space? How is the business cycle working? How's the economy working? And then how is debt working? And I'm keeping on adding on more circles as we go along. What about the value of currencies going up and down, even though Matthew talked about more money being loosened up? Currencies are depreciating. So does that mean we're going to get more money or just more currency, but of a lower value? So if a debt is taken on when your parents thought about you, then it takes about a year to negotiate, for example. Then the political party then takes the rule, and 3-4 years later, you have money floating in an economy, and we're not yet paying off debt, hopefully, for 4 or 5 years. But then you hit the age of 4, and now it's time to make interest payments. And when these interest payments kick in this life cycle approach, this is when you start to see a decrease in services, absence of vaccines in hospitals, and this is something happening across the African continent as we speak. So no vaccines for children, so more children not being born. So this is now changing. And then you start to see these children wanting to go to school, and suddenly the teachers are not paid, and you have strikes in schools. And as this child grows, as we grow, if we are accessing public services, we should hit 18 or 20 and either enter the job market or continue on into some kind of tertiary education. But the debt cycle tends to be 15, 20 years, sometimes 30 years. And often in this 30, 40-year period, government after government, from a 5-year government term or a 7-year government term, they pass on the buck to the next government because they cannot pay it off. And that is the crisis that we see ourselves in many different parts of the world, where each successive government has actually been passing on the debt buck to the next government. And so what I see are these cycles that just don't align. And so I'm going to give you an example specifically. In Angola, as we speak right now, it's 1 million children born every year. It's an oil-rich country. Now, Angola has been paying off its debt, but have been so successful in paying off its debt that now when they want to go for more debt, they're being offered debt, but at a higher interest rate. It feels counterintuitive, but that's the reality on the ground. So the debt that they can take subsequently, because they did well, upgrades their country, because they were reliable, because they have oil. And the result is they're going to pay more interest rate every single time, which then digs into the amount of money available for services and for resources, including vaccines, including drugs. And so this is the cycle that countries face. There are other issues here. There are credit rating agencies who may downgrade a country when they pay off debt. And if that's what takes place, then when you get downgraded, again, your interest rate goes up. So a lot of the financial decisions that are being made across the world actually are starting to undermine the way a country operates, which is not the same as private debt. So what are these most important things? Well, I focus mainly on the need to create a global fiscal body. And although we use the word architecture, I don't like the word architecture because if I talk to my architect friends, they tell me that the building has to look coherent and it has to be streamlined and the lines must look great. And the architecture in place for finance is a building that cannot go beyond one level. It cannot stand. It is barely on its feet. And that is because it is a series of multiple bilateral agreements, whether they are on debt or on taxes, on credit rating agencies, or on any other type of fiscal decision. There's no coherence in it. There is no design to it. It is not one particular picture. So while I fully agree with Winnie, we need to push for this global tax body and the tax convention, but we also need to look beyond it. And I think for me, that is why the Summit of the Future becomes so important. We need to look towards bringing together all the fiscal spaces together. Where does a country go when there is a debt disagreement? Well, you go back to the same entity with whom you have signed the agreement. If it's the IMF, you go back to the IMF and they can opt out of joining in this, the resolution of the issues. If you have a problem with the private bondholder, then you usually end up in arbitration, which is extremely expensive. But what has been happening in the international spaces, as I come to a conclusion, is the following. You have taxation of high net worth individuals starting to be discussed, but it has to also be discussed in every single country in the world. You have conversations around climate taxes and climate debt. However, the debt conversation is completely bypassing the issue of reparations. So climate debt agreements or debt nature swaps or climate nature swaps, climate debt swaps are being debated upon without taking into consideration the polluter. And some of these conversations are still saying we're writing off your debt, but you're going to, hive off a section of your climatic area or your nature reserves. But that doesn't take into consideration the actual pollution and the payment for the pollution. And so for me, the formula in those conversations is lacking completely. And I see the same starting out in the plastics treaty as well, if we're not careful. But it's also about pledges and honor. More and more funds have been set up. There are about 5 of them in climate alone. The pandemic treaty is going to require one as well. And each of these funds have been filled with pledges, and the pledges have not been honored predominantly. And so the funds are empty. And so these funds are now being debated, and some of them want to actually convert them into debt funds, which would, for me, would be extremely problematic. So as I come to a close, what I do want to say is that we have a serious problem with the financing of human rights, but we have a window. Currently, all the fiscal issues are being debated across the world, and it's very important that those that have the need for the financing are ready and able to take it up when the time comes, when the finance gets opened up, and the finance will be opened up. And so I'm glad to have UNAIDS join the battle as always. Thank you very much. And back to you.
Incredible, Atiya. Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you for your insights. I mean, holding on to some of the phrases that you've shared with us, the phrase, there is no health justice without fiscal justice, and just the awareness of how long a debt cycle in relation to other cycles works. 30 to 40 years of a debt cycle. Is it any wonder that we're caught in a poverty cycle, that it persists in the way that it does? We will have a Q&A section at the end. We will ventilate some of the issues that you've heard so far. So please share your questions in the chat as we bring you remarks from our final panelist for today. And our next speaker is Kevin Watkins, one of the world's leading thinkers on international development. And Kevin is a visiting professor at London School of Economics and Political Science. And he was also previously Chief Executive Officer of Save the Children UK. And he joins us today to speak on the impact of debt on education and the need for action. Kevin, over to you.
Thank you very much. And I should say I'm very relieved, actually, I didn't prepare a PowerPoint, because if I had have done, I'd have desperately been trying to redraft it while the 3 previous speakers were speaking, because they were such fantastic contributions. I want to say, first of all, a huge thank you to Winnie, because I think what's really important about the framing of this crisis is that it's not just about one dimension of life. It's not just about HIV/AIDS, although that's clearly critical. It's not just about nutrition. It's not just about education or social protection. It's about the world we want to create. And the UN Secretary General has actually said very clearly that we're at a crossroads where the sustainable development goal ambition could very easily become, in his phrase, the epitaph for the world that we could have created. And I think this discussion of what Matthew and Atia have set out is a roadmap, actually, to how we can move towards the creation of that world. Winnie started by referring to the speech that Julius Nyerere gave actually in London in 1985. And I think it's a great point to start because he took what was essentially a very narrow economic debate at the time and reframed it as a moral debate. And he made it very clear that this was not a rhetorical question, should I starve our children to pay our debt? It was a real choice that was being imposed on his government. And what we had by way of response was, first of all, 10 years of almost complete inertia. And those of us who are above a certain age will remember the litany of the Toronto terms, the Trinidad terms, the Naples terms, the London terms, all of which were about providing a trickle of debt relief through rescheduling. We then had HIPC 10 years after he spoke, but it took another 10 years to hammer HIPC into a shape where it delivered debt relief. That's 20 years. It took over 15 years in the case of Latin America to develop the Brady Plan. Now, the point I want to make is that if we spend the next decade prevaricating in the way that earlier generations of creditors prevaricated, we're going to end up in a very bad place indeed. And so it's fantastic that Winnie and Matthew and others behind debt relief. The second point I wanted to make was really focusing more on education. And everything that has been said about HIV/AIDS could equally be said of education. For those of you who might not know, SDG 4, the education goal, has a commitment to provide quality education for all children and adult learners by 2030 in preschool, in primary school, and in secondary school. And not just getting children into school, but ensuring that they learn something. Well, we currently have around 150 million primary school age and adolescent children who are out of school, 250 million under the age of 18 out of school, many children who are in school for more than 7 or 8 years come out unable to read or write basic sentences, to do basic math. In other words, not prepared for a life in which they can realize their potential. We've just had what will probably go down in history as the greatest reversal in education in Africa and other regions in many generations, as schools closed for 2 years during COVID. Children lost not only the accumulated learning of those 2 years, but of course their memories fade, and so they go back to school starting far behind where they left school. And in the midst of all this, as Matthew has very clearly set out, we have governments across the region paying 2 to 3 times as much to their creditors as they're spending on basic education. That, if you believe, as I do, that the future of nations is something that you can trace in the profile of their education systems and the levels of education of their citizens, we're really creating the groundwork for an even more divided and even more unequal, impoverished world in which the Sustainable Development Goals do indeed become an epitaph for what we could have created. The situation that we're in, I was in a meeting with the 2 agencies in Washington, D.C. recently, the World Bank and the IMF, where there was a sort of undercurrent that, that this is a serious debt problem. but it's not a debt crisis because only a handful of countries have defaulted. And at one level, that's technically true. The other way of looking at that is that countries are not defaulting to their creditors, but they're being forced to default on their own citizens. So that's the situation that we're in. As Winnie and Matthew have said, the common framework is clearly inadequate. We need to move towards what was envisaged in the heavily indebted poor countries initiative, which is a 15% cap on debt servicing for countries who need the restructuring. For countries that still have access, we need to stop putting the interests of BlackRock and other sovereign bondholders and the commercial banks over the interests of citizens. We have an opportunity to do that, I believe, through the G20 process and the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty that Brazil has engineered, and will hand over the G20 presidency to South Africa. And I really look forward to working with Matthew, with Winnie, and with others on this call to translating this commitment in the moral case for debt relief into practical action. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kevin. I mean,
Sonia, you're muted.
I'm mute. You're there. I realized that I was on mute. I was thanking you, Kevin, for that epitaph analogy that you shared with us a little bit earlier on the eve of the Summit of the Future of the General Assembly. It is just something that the world cannot allow. And even the report cites the UNSG's comments that the SDGs are promise and peril, and a rescue plan for people and the planet is desperately needed. Let's kick off our Q&A session in the time remaining. Please post your questions and your comments in the chat function. But Winnie, I'd really love to come back to you, thinking about really the G20, thinking about Summit of the Future and the General Assembly, and you yourself being a global African leader. What do you want to suggest or invite other leaders in the region to do in regard to debt and tax matters?
Azania, thank you. I asked for the floor because I just want to make a point about the sound. To ask the IT to do something. We are not getting good sound. It's getting cut here and there. There's echo. I think we can do better so that we hear well. I want to give the floor to others. I have said my piece. Thank you.
Thank you for that. But Kevin and Matthew, I'd really love to come to you on the G20. When we think of the opportunities and the moments of gathering where the world has an opportunity and global leaders have an opportunity to take action, what would you like to ask of leaders at these platforms? And Matthew, you touched on the fact that we have a prime opportunity with Brazil and South Africa leading the G20 in the coming future. What should that be at the present moment?
I mean, I'd like to ask them for the moon. I'd like to ask them to cancel all of the debt that countries owe, which is forcing them to pay more than 15, preferably 10% of their budgets on debt service. I'd like to ask them to get serious about taxing the wealthy individuals and the rich corporations across the world. And I think there are quite a lot of people in the G20 and in the UN system. Let's not forget that really these things should be being discussed in the UN system because of its legitimacy and because developing countries have more voice there. But I think most of the leaders of the international organizations and a large number of member governments of the G20 want to do those sorts of things. So I think the key question, and I see in the chat somebody has said, what's the major political roadblock to a new deal? You know, maybe 12 months ago, I would have said the US government, but I wouldn't say that anymore because they're actually on the right side of the argument at the moment. I'm not really sure there is any individual government or group of people, except perhaps the commercial sector bondholders, who are just completely refusing to do anything at the moment. And what we can't have, I really liked Atia's thing about the cycle, because I remember the first book that ever inspired me to get passionate about debt was a brilliant book, which is still worth reading now, by a man called Anthony Sampson, called The Moneylenders. And in it, he talks about how exactly what you said, Atiya, in relation to Angola. The moment a country gets out of one debt crisis, there are certain people who have an interest in creating another one. So in the longer term, we have to get out of that cycle. And we saw in Mozambique the crookedness of that, of the deals that went on there, just to make a few people on both sides some money. So we have to sort out those longer term issues as well. But at the moment, I would just like to get the G20 to take really urgent action. I think the only thing which is really restraining them all is this obsession with budget deficits post-COVID. And, you know, you see Germany having a debt break, France deciding that the EU deficits thresholds are the most important thing in its life. You know, everywhere we seem to be obsessed with all of this. And so I would urge them to look beyond their own budgets to the sources of money that could fund this. The IMF has massive gold stocks, which they could sell some of to fund this. They could issue what are called special drawing rights, which are basically additions to reserves, which countries could spend on wiping out the debt tomorrow morning. They could have global taxes on all sorts of various things that are mostly consumed by the wealthy. We could find the money tomorrow morning. So think out of the box. We can get a solution.
You mentioned earlier, in fact, in your presentation, Matthew, that there are other sources that we need to look to. As you said, think out of the box. Here are a few questions from the chat function. Chris Fontaine says, hello, Matthew and Atiya. Thank you for the great presentations. Are you confident that debt relief will result in greater spending on HIV, health, education, social protection, etc.? Is it possible to explicitly link debt relief to domestic investment in these social goods? For my own country, the US, I would not be surprised if the additional fiscal space was used for defense spending. Yeah, so speaking to our priorities, please feel free to address that question. And could we keep it succinct as possible so that we can use the time remaining to reach as many questions as possible? Atiya, Matthew, Kevin?
Atiya, please go ahead if you're...
Okay, sure. Thank you very much. So the biggest challenge that's going to face any state that has additional revenue and the population that lives in the state is that the decision on how money is spent is a decision of the population and the government of that country. So this is one step that we do, right? That we try and unblock the global space. But this requires local communities, domestic populations to seriously participate in the decision-making then that takes place on how spending is made. And yes, defense spending is one of the challenges the whole world faces because defense spending falls under what's called the shadow budget, which means you'll actually never know how much any country in the world is spending on defense. But there are guidelines for Africa, for example. A minimum of 15% supposed to be spent on health under the AU treaties. I think it's 10% on social services, 2% on research. And these are the pointers that we have to use to guide them. So the control on how budgets are spent have actually been decided in regional spaces. I think we need to look at that seriously. But please participate in your government, I guess.
I couldn't agree more with that. I mean, and Kevin, I think you'll remember this as well, because under HIPC, what we did was we said there needs to be accountability for what you're going to spend this money on, and civil society and parliaments were involved in that. And as a result, we actually managed to increase health and education spending by about 2% of GDP in Africa. And pretty much every country ended up with universal free primary education and big steps forward on healthcare as a result. But I think, Kevin, at the time, if I remember rightly, you were in Oxfam leading the campaign to make sure this was accountable.
I was, and actually I think I predated Winnie in Oxfam as well, who continued the great work. But you know, one of the things that we did in Oxfam actually was to work. One of the first countries that went through HIPC and came out the other side was Uganda, and Uganda actually went into the negotiations with a really clear commitment that it would use the savings from debt relief to eliminate user fees first in education and then in health. And that was a model which was then followed in many other countries. And as you said, Matthew, I mean, there's always an issue of fungibility with debt relief. You know, would the money that goes into social sector investment have gone in with or without debt relief, and so on. But the reality is that the evidence shows that social sector spending, as Matthew just said, went up by between 1 to 2% of GDP across the HIPC countries. And so I think with the right processes in place, it's possible to ensure that the savings from debt relief are channeled into progressive social spending.
Right. I'd like to actually invite our audience, our participants, our attendees to ask their questions. So I've got a site of the chat function, and I'd like to invite, is it London office? If you could please open your mic, hopefully also switch on your video and ask your question as you've posted in the chat, but we want your voices as well in this discussion. London office?
Sorry for the mystery caller ID. It's Lucia from Malala Fund. I think the panelists have actually already addressed my question. It was the one about political roadblocks to a new deal on debt. Perhaps they could reflect a little bit about, Matthew, you replied on the G20 political dynamics. Perhaps one of the panelists would like to say something about the private banks, which I see another questioner has put forward, and what are the political roadblocks to bringing the private banks to the table?
Thank you. Atia, that particularly, you were pleased by that question, spotlight on the private banks.
Thank you. I'm pleased by all the questions. They are fantastic. So the biggest challenge that is facing the private bond market, at least for developing countries, is that there is no legislation that guides private bonds. So these are agreements that are private agreements between a state and the bondholder. So the creditor in that case can be an investment firm, can also be private banks who are investing through the investment firms. So that's the first challenge. There are no laws, there's no regulations, it's just that contract agreement itself. And so one of the things I think that is really important is for us to start having regulations around it, for there to be accountability, for populations to be able to see what their countries are borrowing, from whom they're borrowing, why they are borrowing it, what they're going to use it for. I mean, as much as we do criticize and critique the IMF and the World Bank, at least there are some kinds of rules and regulations available for them. But the private banks are also very crucial because of illicit financial flows. The money that is taken out of countries goes through private banks. Sometimes it goes through cash, but the ones that go through the banking system need to be very clearly demarcated. And it needs to be stopped before it leaves the country, not stopped after it lands in another country, because that is the secondary problem we're starting to see. Private banks in the global north will receive the money and then freeze it, and then use it, of course, to build their own economies, give out loans. At the same time, the developing country that's lost this huge chunk of money is going to spend, again, my life cycle approach, is going to spend between 10 and 20 years in getting that money back through legal processes. So time is of the essence. I couldn't also echo Winnie more.
Yeah, thank you for that response, Atia. Next, let's go to Pemberai. Pemberai, are you ready with your question or comment for our panel? Just switch on your mic, and if you want to also go put your video on, we welcome that. Pemberai? If Pemberai is not ready, we can go to Karusa. Karusa, you can be next. We've got you, Pemberai, but you're on mute. If you could unmute. Please unmute your mic.
This is Karusa.
Karusa, yes, go ahead. We're
not
Okay, all right.
Oh, okay, Pemberai.
Finally, so I was getting instruction that to say the host is not allowing you to unmute.
Oh,
so
okay,
my
we've got
question
you
really
now.
is looking at my question is looking at the linear kind of thinking that we always have to say, especially in the case of Africa, it's like invite investors. Investors are going to create jobs, and then from the jobs, that's when you can actually raise the taxation system. And I was presenting this, throwing this to the presenters to say, where do we miss it in that sense? Because the idea is quite linear. It says call upon investors. Investors come in and invest in mines and everywhere, and then you tax them and then you support health. So what's wrong with that? What is wrong with that kind of linear thinking, and where are we missing it along the way? Thank you.
Okay, Pemberai, I'm noting your question about investors, and next we can go to Karusa. Karusa, what is your question for our panel?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the first question I had was answered. It was in regards to the role of the private banks in terms of, and it was answered. And thank you, Atia, or Professor Waris, for having done that. My other question, though, is about, to me, this is all like credit cards. And I think there was a comment that was made earlier. The moment a country gets out of debt, there's another offer to get into debt. And this is very much a cyclical thing, and especially for, I'm going to say young people, but it's really not limited to young people. So for me, I see young countries. And so this kind of like predatory lending, I think is a factor here. And I'm just wondering if there's any comments from the speakers. Thanks.
Thank you, Karusa. Predatory lending and what this kind of leads to, and it just exacerbates the already desperate situation. And then we'll take another question. We've got Pata Kamalingin, if you could also ask your question, and then we'll get our panelists to respond to this group of questions that have been posed. Pata Kamalingin. If Pata, all right, so behind the scenes, we'll try and get Pata ready, but maybe if our panelists could address the two questions that we've heard so far, and we'll come back to this question. So the first one was from Pemberai about taxing industries and organizations such as mining companies as they come in to benefit, doing more of that, and saying that why is there, we tend to approach this from a linear perspective. Any takers for that one?
Well, I'll have a go.
Okay, Kevin.
I think it's a really important point, because the point of investment, the type of investment needed is investment that adds value. It also generates revenue for investment in critical areas. And the specific problems, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, but not exclusively, is the use referred to, which are by intent designed to create incentives for investors to come in, but are often so wide-ranging that the incentive effects are not very clear. The design is often not very transparent, so it's very difficult to work out where the exemptions are going, and the losses are very great. So, for example, low-income countries are losing around 2%, 2 to 3% of GDP each year through these tax exemptions. When you add to those exemptions tax avoidance, especially in the mining sector, actually, where the IMF estimates that Africa is losing around $750 million annually. Now, these losses are almost equivalent to directing a subsidy towards an area of activity that has no value at all. So I think clawing in those losses could make a huge difference. And this is an area in which the G20 could make a big difference. I just wanted to add one short point on commercial debt and sovereign debt. And there is a distinction between commercial bank debt or debt owed to trading companies and sovereign bond debt for the reasons that Atia set out. But one of the common themes in the resolution of previous debt crises has been when major creditor governments step up to the plate and call a halt to commercial banks defining the terms of debt settlement. That's what happened with the Brady bonds, if you remember, when the big US commercial banks were essentially told that they would be facilitated to secure a return, but it would be a return more in line with the price that debt was being traded at on the secondary market than on the face value of the debt. Now, something like that needs to happen in relation to commercial debt today, including sovereign bond debt, but we clearly don't currently have the governance structures. We do, however, have financial levers, which the World Bank, the IMF, and creditor governments could pull if they had the political disposition to do that.
Yeah, which speaks to Carusa's point about the predatory quality and character that we tend to find in the lending sector. Let's see who we have next. Pata, are you able to open up your mic and ask your question? I know that you're back in the session now, Pata. Peter Kamalingen. I have one point that says it as Pata, and the other one is says that it's Peter Kamalingen. Peter?
No, yeah, thanks. Thank you very much. And
welcome.
Sorry, I think I dropped off. I've dropped off. Thanks very much, Matthew and Kevin and Atia and Winnie for that input. That was very, very useful and very rich. No, I think, when you look at what's happening in the world today, I mean, with the multilateral system, the broken system, and the sense of hopelessness, of course, one can be excused for losing hope. But then I realize hope is the only thing you have control over, so we don't need to lose that. So we have to keep the fight as we learn from what we see every day. But Matthew, I just wanted to, because you did make I think a useful recommendation to the effect that an ask of capping the debt service to the budget revenue at 15% for 10 years, if I heard you correctly, yeah? If we keep it at that for 10 years, was it on the assumption that we would also be freezing the interest rate at that time? Because the worry is that if that continues, 10 years is a short time. And if you you go back to Atia's life cycle, of course, we don't want to be pushing this to those who come after us as well. So I wanted to understand that, because I think for me, in many ways, if you look at the injustices around this whole lending system and all that, I mean, we should be going for debt cancellation. Of course, granted, we need to learn from what are the accountabilities of what happens when your debt is forgiven, what you need to do differently, because we know that there are, of course, tough lessons to learn from HIPIC and whatever has happened or not happened. So I just wanted to just ask for that, rather than just be pushing for this, would we be more forthright in pushing for debt cancellation, rather than postponing it to the generations that come after? Because the foundation, the departure point is that there's injustice anyway in how these were arrived at.
Peter, thank you for that very thoughtful question, because it links the two presentations so well. Matthew, please go ahead. And Atia, it would be good to get your comments as well.
Thanks, Azania. Yes, Peter, really, really good question. And I just also want to come in, sort of link that up to some of the other questions that were asked earlier on. I think definitely we should all be pushing for cancellation. I mean, last time the Jubilee debt campaign won its case because we got the debt cancelled and because we had a very clear message to present to world leaders that we wanted the debt cancelled. However, if you look at the amount of debt which would have to be cancelled now, you are probably talking in the order of $2 trillion, which, if you say that number in any international forum, everybody will put up their hands in horror or run out of the room and say that's impossible to pay for. So that's why we and a whole group of CSOs across the world are asking for debt service cancellation, for a 10-year debt service holiday for countries. And obviously that would mean not putting more interest on the debt in the meantime. But I do think we also need to look beyond this, because I really was so glad that the colleague used the phrase predatory lending. We have a major proposal which the Norwegian government has said they want to run with as fast as possible, which is to stop that. So predatory lending, for those of you who don't know, can be anything. It means debt that has ridiculously high interest rates. It means debt that in Mozambique avoided all the government approval procedures. It means debt that has no development purpose whatsoever and is just there for crookedness, etc. And we have to stop that from happening, because a large amount of that debt is still being borrowed, and various crooks on both sides are still making money out of it. And the proposal that we have is there's a thing that the UN already has the leadership on called the Convention Against Corruption. And I've been assured by the world's best lawyers that we can add a protocol into that which would ban what they call the enforcement of predatory lending. In other words, if you did either predatory lending or even predatory debt relief, you would never have the right in any court in the world to claim the service on that debt, because it would be judged predatory and unenforceable. And related to that, and our big campaign in the UK at the moment is to bring back in a new law, like the one that I helped Gordon Brown write back in just sort of 2008-9, which was to stop the worst commercial creditors, what we used to call the vultures, from coming in and demanding that they get paid the full amount of the debt by a country which hasn't paid anything on its debt for 10 or 15 years. Now, things have changed a bit since last time, in the sense that we've moved from commercial banks to bonds, but not nearly as much as people pretend. I studied at LSE under Susan Strange, and she taught me that the first ever bond default was on tulip bonds in the 1800s, the 1700s, late 1700s, when people in the Netherlands tried to defraud everybody into investing far too much in the future prospects of tulips. And you can easily do default. People have been defaulting on their bonds and getting huge reductions for hundreds of years. So we need to get serious. And I just really want to end on the point that was made, I think, by Kevin. What we don't have at the moment is political will by the official sector to confront the commercial sector. I was quite shocked in various meetings I've been in recently to see the deference with which we are now treating the commercial sector. Of course, they have a right to make money. And of course, good investors should be rewarded with good profits, and then they should pay tax on those profits. But bad investors and bad creditors should not. And if they have invested and made a fortune on the debt already, it's time for them to take the hit as well as the official creditors. And we just all need to get a lot tougher in saying that and in insisting that action is taken.
Telling it like it is. Thank you for that, Matthew. Next, we've got Chris Fontaine. Let's hear your question or comment.
Hi, thanks.
Hi, Chris.
I think Matthew has addressed some of it already. And I guess I'd preface this by saying that I'm not an expert. So please excuse if I get things mixed up. But I think my question is ultimately, how much leverage or agency or power do these indebted countries have when they are in negotiations with private lenders or even public lenders? And can a country, for example, threaten to not pay or to default on private debt that could be considered predatory? So I think that's my first clear question. And then secondly is that it seems that some countries get bailed out when they go insolvent and can't pay their debts. I think Argentina is sort of a famous example in the past. But why isn't that an avenue just to say, well, we're going bankrupt, we can't pay, sorry, and then and essentially then force the international financial institutions to act? What are the pros and cons of doing something like that? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Pros and cons. And is that even possible? What's the card that countries can play when it's just too impossible for them to continue in this predatory debt cycle? Matthew, Atiya?
Okay, shall I take it, Matthew? Yeah, okay. So because all of this happens behind closed doors, the best answer I can give you is actually examples. So you gave the example, Chris, of Argentina. But maybe if you look into actually what's happening to Argentina right now, that's what is probably more telling. Argentina's currency in a 1.5 to 2 year period went from, I guess, 250 pesos to the dollar to overnight hitting 280 pesos to the dollar. 6 months later was on 800 pesos to the dollar, and the last time I checked, more than 6 or 8 months ago, was 1,000 pesos to the dollar. Nobody's salaries have changed, nobody's earnings have changed, but the value of each peso has gone down to 25% of what it was 2 years ago. And this is not the only country that is happening. In Ghana, they literally just slashed off zeros of their currency and then reissued them. That's what they did. So when a country defaults or threatens to default, the effect is, yes, they can do the threat, they can make the threat, they can then say they're going to default. And then what can happen is a series of issues. They can accept to freeze the debt, they can say they are going to waive the debt, they will then ask for the currencies to be revalued and usually valued downwards. And this is what has been happening. So you see it from what is out in the world. But what is the most worrying thing when that happens is that it kills the ability of a country to take a loan ever again. They get declared junk status, getting back onto a routine where you can get a loan at a decent interest rate becomes a real challenge. And I think that becomes the question. And this is why I keep looking at human beings' life cycles, because that next group of people are not going to get any money, and they're not going to be able to rebuild. So there's also a cause to be, I like to talk about no interest loans. I don't understand why we put interest on loans to build countries. This is not a commercial transaction. And I know it's very controversial. I'm for debt cancellation, so I'm taking advantage of having the floor. But I don't think it is so unusual. The example that I like to use is actually Germany after World War II, because after World War II, Germany didn't just have its loan completely wiped clean. For the only time in the history between the US and Germany, the US allowed US companies working in Germany to pay taxes in Germany, not in the United States. So what you had was not just debt cancellation, you also had an injection of finance into that particular country. And look at where Germany is now. So we have to also talk about what that looks like. And maybe that is the management example we need to talk about. And that would allow us to bring all the financial spaces together. But I also want to say the problem with the linear example that we were getting on investment is to an external person or entity, but never an investment to the local populations. So many countries have spent 20 years building the education of their countries. And now, instead of giving them capital to set up businesses, they're encouraging them to leave the country and build somebody else's economy as an employee. Like, I don't understand that. That for me seems very counterintuitive as well. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Thanks, Atiya. Next, let's hear from Jane. Jane Kalwe. Jane, the floor is yours. Good afternoon.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon. A quick one. I'm like Chris. I'm not an expert, but I'm beginning to reflect on these issues a lot, especially as we think about sustainability. And so, the previous cancellations, was there any impact on the social sector, if any, and what lessons can we pick from that experience? Thank you.
Thank you for that, Jane. Anyone want to respond? Go for it, Matthew.
Yeah, I mean, I think we hinted at this earlier on, but maybe rather than just, saying spending went up as 2% of GDP or whatever it was, I mean, millions of children got fee-free education, and in many cases got education for the first time. I remember being in Sao Tome when they got their debt cancellation, and they suddenly realized they'd have enough money to actually bring all the children who had been stuck on the former slave-run cocoa plantations of the Portuguese into schools, where they had been not getting any schooling at all in the rural areas of Sao Tome until then. And millions of people got free access to medical treatment. But as we all know now, there's the new set of problems along. And And we need to be sure if we did the same now, we could be saying, let's have free secondary education for everybody. Let's make sure that, as we've been focusing on in this seminar, that there is free AIDS treatment for everybody. Let's make sure that there's social protection for everybody. Let's make sure that there's food for everybody. There's a huge amount that we can do. Just perhaps one word on the linear side as well. You know, I prefer to take the flip side of that linear argument, because people focus on the, oh my God, won't it be a disaster? And some of the creditors I've been talking to recently have been going, if we do debt relief, countries will never have access to foreign investment or bond markets again. That is, excuse my language, bullshit. Basically, it's the opposite that is true. All the lessons, including from Uganda when it got its first lot of debt relief. And I think I was negotiating that debt relief in Paris at the same time as Winnie was sitting in the next door office. We didn't know each other then, as a staff member of the Ugandan embassy. And basically, when Uganda got that debt relief was when all the people came back and said, yes, if you need access to trade credit, we'll give it to you. Yes, we'd like to invest in your country. Why? Because once you've got the debt relief, they know you are not struggling to breathe from the burden of the debt, and you'll be able to afford to pay them what they have earned legitimately in profits, or what they should ask for legitimately as the cost of their loans. So, you know, I think some people have forgotten that, and some people in the commercial sector particularly need to wake up and remember that that's the lesson. And if what you do is strangle countries to try to get the debt service out of them in the short term, you will all lose, including your investors and your creditors.
Matthew, thank you so much. We're concluding this session. Thank you so much for all the thoughtful questions that have been raised. But I'd like to wrap things up by just getting a final closing reflections from our panelists after it all. And I want to end with you, Winnie, but if we could just have a 2-minute reflection from each of you on what this moment means and the opportunity that lies ahead. And possibly even a challenge or something, a thought around the actions that can be taken. Let's wrap up, but Kevin, let me start with you.
Well, maybe to start where Winnie came in, actually, because there are a lot of enormously complicated financial issues surrounding debt and debt relief. But there are also simple ones, is that if you're in an international system, which allows countries, the poorest countries in the world, to spend around $30 per child on basic education, to spend around $7 or $8 per citizen on health, but allows it to repay creditors $50 to $60 per citizen, there is something wrong with the system. And I think that's the starting point of a lot of the discussion. If you look at the results of previous debt relief, and especially HIPC, it's not, as Matthew said, it's not just measured in financial terms. All of the enrollment indicators surged after debt relief. All of the health indicators, especially vaccination and attendance at primary health clinics, improved after debt relief. And I think the question, the question that the wider international community, and especially the creditor community, have to ask, and this comes back to the question that was raised about default. One of the reasons that many countries were forced into unsustainable debt was the shortage of access to affordable capital to finance key social sector investments. Now, many of those same countries have already lost access to sovereign bond markets, or they're doing crazy stuff like Kenya of refinancing sovereign bond debt at 12%, which is a prescription for bankruptcy in my view. So I think the reality is we're either moving towards a situation for many countries of them being pushed into disorderly default, which is in nobody's interest, or we move towards an arrangement where there's a governance framework for providing debt relief along the sort of the model that Matthew has outlined, which is a win-win scenarios for investors, for citizens of countries, and for global financial stability. I do believe we have an enormous opportunity with Brazil's presidency of the G20 and then South Africa to set the wheels in motion on that.
Zania, you're muted.
Thank you for those words, Kevin. Atia, could I please come to you next for your closing remarks?
Thank you. I'd like to say two things. The first is that we need to keep everything very human. The human being has to be the central focus of every conversation, whether it is on debt or taxes or illicit financial flows. And this is why I really appreciate the conversations we're having, because it's about what you're spending things on. And so we have to keep that focus in all the time. When you take a debt, how is that impacting the human being on the ground? The second is the need to break silos. So very often when we look at issues of debt, then we don't look at tax. Well, tax is what is then used to pay off the debt. And so the reality on the ground of the ability of these human beings and companies to pay off that debt comes from the tax that they're then paying. And so then if we have this framework of secrecy jurisdictions and tax havens and illicit financial flows or encouraging repatriation of capital without taxing it, then you lose out on it. And the measurements that countries and institutions have been putting in place for generations has been an assumption that whatever economic productivity comes out of a country after it takes on debt will be what will be then used to pay off the debt using taxes. But the system isn't actually set up that way. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Atia. Matthew, your final words?
Sure. Look, I want to really focus down because I know that Winnie cares passionately about what this means for UNAIDS. And I know we plan, and I'm sure Winnie will say more about this in a minute, to have much more detailed interactions with all of the UNAIDS people on this call to push this forward. But I think what we need over the next at least 12 to 15 months, if we're going to get any serious progress on all these issues, is the political level work. I'm sure we can all be happy to rely on Winnie to scream loudly from the rooftops, as she always does, in a very convincing way, what is necessary. But she needs to be joined by other African leaders. And I think that's the big challenge over the next 12 months, is to get African leaders to have a coordinated position. I was quite glad, totally by chance, to see President Ruto saying that he also wants a 10-year debt service holiday the other day. I'm not quite sure where that came from, but, you know, we need every African leader to be backing tax changes and debt changes to get this done and committing to spending the money on the right things too. And then at the sort of lower level internal, there's a lot of work to be done on getting plans together at national level. We've done some work also with Charles and Jaime on putting together national level profiles, which could be really useful for pushing the debate forward at national level. But yes, there are going to need to be I wouldn't say not action plans, because you've already got those in place for what to do about AIDS. But what would you spend this money on if you got it is a very important question that needs to be answered by African governments and citizens from the beginning. So I would like to say, you know, we're all in the one thing which is really different, or has been really different for the last few years, is that Africa is speaking out, that we're in a time of genuine, if I can put it this way, verbal decolonization. We don't just listen to people from the north anymore, and that's why I'm proudly wearing my African clothes as a proud African. We say the Africans must speak out, and we need the Africans to speak out, both the leaders and the people, to say enough is enough. We're sick of being strangled by new taxes to pay debts. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Matthew, and for the earlier presentation. For those of you who may have missed what Matthew has shared in the chat, it's a link, in fact, if you want more information on the history of debt relief and the things that can be proposed and have been proposed around predatory lending. Please just click on the link that he has shared to a report that they have done. Winnie, you have the final word. I know you've been listening intently. Let's hear from you as we close off.
Thank you very much, moderator. I want to take the opportunity to thank Matthew and his team, working with Jaime in preparing these reports for us. You've given us a voice. on a very important question for our work, our mission of leading the world to end AIDS by 2030. The global response is at a crossroads, because right now we have a deficit of $10 billion in the global response. We have, of course, the high-burdened countries of Africa shouldering the bigger burden of the response themselves. Our estimate is that 59% of the response is paid for by the developing countries themselves, low income and middle income. But the 40% that is closed by mainly ODA is at risk, is not there because of shifting priorities. The ODA that goes to global health has peaked, is declining. And within that, the fraction that goes to HIV/AIDS is also declining. That is why we commissioned these reports to explore what it will take for countries to raise the domestic resources, to raise other resources that they need outside ODA to be able to treat, keep their people alive on treatment, people living with HIV, and to prevent new infections. It's about prevention and about treatment and how to pay for both. Prevention, as we know, takes us to the area outside the health sector, to addressing the real drivers of risk. These lie in the education sector, keeping girls in school, social protection. These are sectors that have to be financed in order for us to close the tap on new infections. That is why we thought it very important to show the impact on the HIV response of declining domestic revenues. We see a decline there too. The amount that is raised as a fraction of GDP has been stagnant, even declining. The impact of tax that is regressive, the failure to tax the rich companies, to close tax loopholes, to be able to keep the resources in the country for these sectors that are important for our work. And then the issue of debt. We thank you very much for these two reports because they are going to be our contribution to the Secretary General's call for the reform of the global financial architecture, and in particular on urgent, meaningful, comprehensive restructuring of debt. This is our contribution. That's why we are launching them on the eve of the Summit of the Future. We hope that we can be part of raising the voice for this change. In fact, there is reason to be hopeful because at the G20, as I just said earlier, we are seeing a momentum. And from my conversation with Matthew, it seems that there is a growing sense both in Europe, in the northern constituency, on the need to move on the issue of debt restructuring. So our reports, we hope, will make a contribution there. Now, for our country directors, I want you to integrate what you learn from these reports in the work you're doing in the countries on defining sustainability roadmaps. These roadmaps are not just technical exercises. They are political exercises. They are about governments sitting with people living with HIV, with all stakeholders, and defining a sustainability roadmap, a way that the country will transition from depending on external assistance to owning and paying for its national response. This means being part of the discussion about how to handle the debt issue, how to raise more domestic resources, how to change tax policies so that more revenues can be collected from the super rich and the companies. So let this work inform what you're doing, the conversations you're having with governments on sustainability roadmaps. We plan to have another workshop, internal one, for country directors and their teams working on these roadmaps to discuss in more detail and give you what you need to be part of this conversation, to make the political shift, the political ownership that we want at country level. I thank very much Jaime and your team, thanking our panelists today. You were brilliant. Atia, Kevin, Matthew, you've engaged us in a good conversation here, and it's just the beginning. We hope to continue with you. Going forward, please take the message everywhere at the ANGA meetings and be part of the demand for debt restructuring that will be meaningful for the countries, the low-income countries of Africa and others. Thank you so much. Thank you, moderator, and have a good day or evening, wherever you are.
Thank you very much for those final words, Winnie. I just want to remind everyone who is attending that we've added links in the chat function for you to read those reports. As our panelists have emphasized, please look at the details. They're very rich. And also, if you have any more questions, please, Charles Birungi is available to assist you further, and his details are also in the chat function. Thank you so much. You've been exceptional. This was truly an enriching conversation. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Okay. Done. Did we take more time?